This is a continuation of reflexive verbs for 9th standard students. I hope the last video which I made for the 8th standards and which you also should have watched has jogged your memory a little bit and revised what you had done in the 8th standard as regards these kinds of reflexive verbs. Okay, so let's carry on. We need to study how the reflexive verbs behave and conjugate themselves in the different tenses that you have learned, as well as some changes in the negative versions of these sentences. Okay, so in the present tense, just to revise, for example, I've taken here se laver is to wash oneself. Okay, so I wash myself, you wash yourself, basically to have a bath. So you have to conjugate laver as a normal ER verb here. Okay, and that se has to change according to the subject. So it becomes je me lave, tu te laves, il se lave, nous nous lavons, vous vous lavez, il se lave, and elle se lave. Okay, I've not put elle here, but elle conjugates the same way il is conjugated. Okay, for all cases. Now, we had done this last time, how you do the simple present tense. Now, what happens when you want to do a simple present tense, but in the negative version? This would be the affirmative. What happens if you want to make a simple present tense in the negative with a reflexive verb? You have to place a n before the reflexive component and pa after the verb. So if you are dealing with a normal verb, you would put n before the verb and pa after the verb, right? But now you are not doing that. You are putting n before the reflexive component because the reflexive component has to stick to the verb. Remember that. Okay, reflexive component sticks to the verb. Nothing can come in between them. So the n has to come before the reflexive component and the pa will remain after them. That doesn't change. Just remember that the n has to come before the reflexive component, not before the verb. Okay. So it becomes je ne me lave pas, I do not wash myself. Tu ne te laves pas, you don't wash yourself. Il ne se lave pas, nous ne nous lavons pas. Vous ne vous lavez pas, il ne se lave pas. Okay, it will never be je me ne lave pas. No, the me and the lave have to stick together. Okay, that is the basic rule. Reflexive and the verb have to stick together. Okay, so this is how you do the present tense in the affirmative and in the negative. Okay. Now, the next two simple tenses you have done are the future proche, which you do a layer conjugate in the present according to the subject, and then the full verb. Okay, and passé récent. So let's start with the future proche. For example, I've taken se brosser. Se brosser is to brush your teeth. Okay, so remember for the future proche, you are conjugating a layer and not the verb, right? So you conjugate a layer as normal, a layer will stick to the subject. Okay, and the reflexive component will stick to the verb. Now here, since it's a future proche and you're conjugating a layer already, you are not conjugating the verb, right? You are not conjugating the verb. That rule sticks. But the reflexive component has to change. Okay, so this will not become bros, brosson, brosser, bros. Brosser will remain brosser, but the reflexive component has to change. Okay, you are conjugating a layer as normal. Remember, a layer will stick to the subject, reflexive component will stick to the verb. So it'll become je vais me brosser, I'm going to brush my teeth. Tu vas te brosser, you're going to brush your teeth. Il va se brosser, he's going to brush his teeth. Nous allons nous brosser, vous allez vous brosser, ils vont se brosser, and elles vont se brosser. Okay, so this is how you have to do it in the future proche. Similarly, you will have to do it for the passé récent. Okay, you have to conjugate venir here. So venir will stick to the subject. You have not to conjugate the actual verb here. So that brosser will remain brosser, or whichever verb you're taking remains as it is. But the reflexive component has to be conjugated as per the subject. Remember here, layer is sticking to the subject, venir is sticking to the subject, reflexive sticks to the verb, reflexive sticks to the verb, and the has to come after venir. So it roughly becomes je viens de me brosser, I've just brushed my teeth. Tu viens de te brosser, just brush your teeth. Il vient de se brosser, nous venons de nous brosser. Vous venez de vous brosser, il vient de se brosser. Okay, so this is roughly how it works for this future proche and the passé récent. Remember, layer and venir stick to the subject, the reflexive component sticks to the verb. For these two tenses, you do not have to conjugate the verbs. You have to change the reflexive component as per the subject. Now, passé composé, you have to be very, very careful when you're conjugating for reflexive verbs. So I've taken, for example, your s'occuper, which is to occupy yourself, to keep yourself busy, okay, things like that. So now, how do you do passé composé for reflexive verbs? The first golden rule for reflexive verbs in the passé composé is that they are conjugated using être and not avoir. Okay, even if they are not the Dr. Mrs. Vandertramp, all reflexive verbs conjugate passé composé using être and not avoir. So the moment you see this se, it has to be conjugated using être in the passé composé. Okay. So now what is the golden rule when you're conjugating Dr. Mrs. Vandertramp in the passé composé? You have to agree the participle with the subject, right? So same way that rule applies here as well. You will have to agree the participle with the subject. Okay? So it becomes je me suis occupé. Now see where the me has been placed. It has been placed before the auxiliary. Okay, so here there is no sticking happening to the verb. The auxiliary comes in between. Okay, so it is subject, reflexive component, auxiliary, participle. Okay, that is how it is in the passé composé. So je me suis occupé. Can you see how être has been conjugated throughout for the passé composé and the reflexive components also? Okay, so je me suis occupé, tu t'es occupé, il s'est occupé, elle s'est occupée, nous nous sommes occupés, vous vous êtes occupés, ils se sont occupés, elles se sont occupées. Okay. Now, can you see how the agreement has been done? If it's a female speaking here, she'll have to add an e. Same way, if you're speaking to a female here, you'll have to add an e. Il will never add an e because it's he, right? Elle will compulsorily have an e because it's she. Then nous will compulsorily have an s. It will also have an e if you're talking about all females. Same way, vous will always have an s because it's plural. Okay, if you're talking about all females, then an extra e. Il will have just an s because it's males in the plural, and elle will compulsorily have e and s because it's females in the plural. This is how you have to do passé composé for reflexive verbs. Remember, être, not avoir, participle agreeing with the subject. The structure of it is subject, reflexive component, être, participle, and agree the participle if it's necessary. Okay, the last tense that you have to do is the imperative or the imperative. Okay, so I've taken some usage here to enjoy yourself. Now, when you're doing your normal present tense, okay, you have to take the reflexive component before the verb, right? Now, when you're doing the imperative tense, you will conjugate the verb as normal. So if it's an er verb in the imperative, you drop the last s in the tu form. That rule still applies, but the placement of this reflexive component will change. Okay, in your normal present tense, it is placed before the verb. So it'll be tu t'amuses, nous nous amusons, vous vous amusez. Okay, that nous, vous is placed before the verb. But when you're doing it in the imperative, the reflexive component goes after the verb. Because remember, in the imperative, the verb has to start the sentence. So the reflexive component goes after the verb. Okay, and it is separated by a hyphen in between or a dash, and the verb conjugates normally. Now, for tu, when you're doing the simple present tense, it is tu t'amuses, right? T apostrophe. Now, when you're doing the imperative, when the T apostrophe goes on the other side, it becomes toi. Okay, compulsorily, you cannot have amused, it will be amuse toi. Okay, and don't forget the dash. So this is an ER verb, so the last S is dropped for the tu form. That rule still applies. So tu t'amuses becomes in the imperative amuse-toi. Nous nous amusons in the present tense. In the imperative, it will become amusons-nous. Let's enjoy ourselves. This will be enjoy yourself. This will be enjoy yourselves. Okay, in the simple present, it is vous vous amusez. You have to cancel off the subject like normal when you're making it imperative, and then bring the reflexive component over to the other side of the verb, separated with the dash. Okay, that is how you have to do imperative. Now this is positive affirmative imperative. What happens when you need to do the negative of the imperative? Now when you're doing the negative of the imperative, the reflexive component comes back to its original place before the verb. Okay, this is a bit of hide and seek going on, musical chairs with the verbs and the reflexive components. So remember, positive imperative or affirmative imperative, the reflexive component goes after the verb, separated by a hyphen. In the negative imperative, the reflexive component is in its normal place. Okay, you will place ne before the reflexive component, pa after the reflexive component. This is similar to the present tense, but remember, the ER verbs lose the last S in the tu form. So in the present tense, tu ne t'amuses pas. But remember, in the imperative, you just have to knock off the subject, and this is imperative negative. So you are not doing any jugglery with the reflexive component going after and all that. That is only in the positive imperative. So it becomes ne t'amuse pas, don't enjoy yourself. Ne nous amusons pas, let's not enjoy ourselves. Ne vous amusez pas, don't enjoy yourselves. Okay, so remember, positive imperative, the reflexive component goes after the verb. Te becomes toi. Okay, nous and vous remain the same, separated with a hyphen. And the imperative negative, it's similar to the simple present tense where you just strike off the subject. And for ER verbs, the normal rule of striking off the last S in the in the imperative still applies. I hope this video has made it clear as to how you have to conjugate the reflexive verbs, the different rules that you have to apply for the positive tenses as well as the negative tenses for the present tense and the imperative. Thank you.